Welcome everyone. I'm Clark and I'm the producer of this channel. I'm from Lehi, Utah. I started Study My Gospel to provide another resource of online gospel learning. I partner with professional gospel instructors for our various series, including Come Follow Me, Gospel Topics, and more to come. If you like the content, please subscribe. Enjoy the video.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to take a few minutes and talk to you today about the miracle of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Now, there's a lot of complex historical sources surrounding the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, but in understanding it, it helps a lot if you can get clear in your mind the timeline regarding how the Book of Mormon came forth. So here's just a rough overview, then we'll go into some details. It appears, based on the historical record, that Joseph Smith receives the plates in September of 1827. He's given them by the angel Moroni, and then for the next several months, he stays in Palmyra, New York, until about December of 1827, when he and Emma moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania, near where Emma's family lives. From there, Joseph Smith engages in translation during the winter and spring of 1828, up until about July, when Martin Harris convinces Joseph Smith to give him the manuscript that they produced, the 116 pages, Joseph Smith calls it, and they lose the manuscript. At this point, Joseph Smith is briefly unable to translate, has the plates and the interpreters taken from him, and he receives them back again in September of 1828. From September to the spring of 1829, Joseph Smith only translates sporadically here and there until Oliver Cowdery shows up in April of 1829, and then they begin to move really, really quickly. The majority of the Book of Mormon is translated from April to June of 1829, and in two locations, in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and in the last month in the farm of the Whitmer family, which is located in Fayette, New York. So just to get all these locations clear in your mind, here's the Hill Cumorah. This is where Joseph Smith receives the plates, and he immediately takes them to his family's house, which is located about a mile away in Palmyra. Very little, if any, translation takes place during this time because Joseph Smith is studying the plates, and there's intensive persecutions. People are trying to take the plates from them at all times. It eventually gets so bad that Joseph decides to relocate to the farm in Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Emma Smith's family lives. And this recreated cabin you see right here is where a lot of the translation takes place of the Book of Mormon. This is where the lost manuscript is translated in the winter of 1828. This is where, when Oliver Cowdery shows up in the spring of 1829, they begin doing a lot of the translation. But eventually persecution here becomes pretty intense as well. And so for about the last month of translation, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery relocate to the Whitmer farm in Fayette, New York, and spend their time with the Whitmer family, where a lot of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon are drawn from. Now, when we imagine Book of Mormon translation, it's common for us to think of Joseph kind of hunched over the plates and looking at the plates and looking through some sort of medium at the plates. The sources themselves paint a slightly different picture, and so let me walk you through a few of those really quickly. Number one, the two people that know the most about translation are the two people that we have the least amount of information from. Joseph and Oliver Cowdery are the two that are involved almost in the entire translation process, but they both die relatively young and both don't say very much during their lifetimes about translation. About as specific as Joseph Smith gets comes in the Wentworth letter, which is written in 1842. At that point, Joseph Smith gives a detailed description of the plates. He said these records were engraven on plates which had the appearance of gold. Each plate was 6 inches wide and 8 inches long and not quite so thick as common tin. With the records was found a curious instrument with the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. Then he said, through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. Oliver Cowdery was also interviewed near the end of his life by a man named Reuben Miller, and this is what Miller recorded Oliver saying to him. Oliver said, I wrote with my own pen the entire Book of Mormon, save a few pages, as it fell from the lips of the prophet Joseph Smith. As he translated it by the gift and power of God, by the means of the Urim and Thummim, or as it is called by that book, Holy Interpreters. I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also beheld the interpreters. That book is true. So Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery both talk about Nephite interpreters that are described within the Book of Mormon. Other witnesses of the Book of Mormon, especially Emma Smith and the Whitmer family, talked about other instruments being used, for instance, a seerstone. David Whitmer, who was one of the Whitmer's sons, and also one of the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon, described translation like this. He said, Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude light. And in the darkness, a spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. He further describes this. He said, Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was his principal scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear. So instead of looking directly at the plates, what David Whitmer describes is that Joseph Smith is receiving the text via the instruments. This isn't a normal translation process that is revelatory, and the text was coming from the plates, but Joseph Smith is receiving them through the means of the seer stone, which he kept in a hat. This painting that you see right here is by Anthony Sweat, and it depicts the way David Whitmer described the translation process, Whitmer along with several people. Now, you may have noticed right away some of the difficulties surrounding the sources of Book of Mormon translation, chiefly that some sources describe the Nephite interpreters, which are described in the Book of Mormon, and other sources describe the use of a seer stone. Several members of Joseph Smith's family, for instance, talked about the Nephite interpreters being the instrument that Joseph Smith used. For instance, Lucy Mack Smith, who's Joseph Smith's mother, was very, very nervous that he was going to lose the plates, that he kept storing them in different places, and she was just kind of a nervous wreck, wondering if Joseph was going to lose the plates. She said the one time when Joseph Smith returned home from receiving the plates, he said to his mother, "Do not be uneasy. All is right. See here," said he, "I have got a key." She notes, "I knew not what he meant, but took the article in my hands, and after examining it with no covering but a silk handkerchief, found that it consisted of two smooth, three-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glass was set in silver bows, connected with each other in the same way that old-fashioned spectacles are made." So she wasn't allowed to see the interpreters, but Joseph allowed them to hold the interpreters in a silk handkerchief, and she was able to feel them. Other people described a seer stone that Joseph Smith used that it appears he had in his possession from about 1816 onward. Emma Smith, for instance, explained that by use of the Urim and Thummim, that portion of the translation after the part that Martin Harris was lost, after that he used a small stone, not exactly black, but it was rather a dark color. This stone that you see on the screen right here is a photograph that was published in 2015 alongside the Joseph Smith Papers Project regarding translation. Now, there are several seer stones that float around out there, but this one has the clearest provenance that ties itself back to Joseph Smith. Apparently, Joseph gave this stone to Oliver Cowdery once the translation process was finished. Oliver kept it until his death when it came to his widow, Elizabeth Cowdery, who then gave it to Phineas Young, the brother of Brigham Young, and it's been in church possession ever since. We don't know for sure if this is the seer stone that was used in translation, but it does fit several descriptions pretty accurately, and it has a clear provenance that goes back to Joseph Smith, so it's likely this might have been the instrument that was used in translation. Now, in talking about all these things, it's careful not to miss the forest for the trees. It is true that based on the historical accounts we have, Joseph Smith likely used several different instruments to translate the Book of Mormon. At least the Nephite interpreters and the seer stone. It's likely there may have been other seer stones that he utilized as well. But all these witnesses in talking about the description of the process were clear in saying it wasn't a normal translation process. It wasn't him looking at the page and then deciphering the words. It was the words coming to him through revelation, and the plates were there as a witness that the record was real. For instance, Emma Smith, after she was done talking about the seer stone in different parts of translation, bore her testimony and said this. She testified, "My belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. I'm satisfied that no man could have dictated the writing of the manuscripts unless he was inspired. For when acting as his scribe, your father would dictate to me hour after hour, and when returning after meals or after interruptions, he could at once begin where he left off, without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was a usual thing for him to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this, and for one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible." Now, to some people, it can be a little bit difficult to hear about the seer stone as opposed to the Nephite interpreters, which is the story most church members are familiar with. Part of the reason why the seer stone has garnered more attention in recent years is that as we gain more historical distance from the translation process, we become a little bit more comfortable using descriptions from people like Emma Smith and Martin Harris and David Whitmer, who didn't necessarily stay in the church, though some of them rejoined and came west, but gave extensive descriptions later on in their lives about how translation process worked. There's no indication that any of these people ever had any doubts that what Joseph Smith was doing was inspired, and that the Book of Mormon came forth by inspiration and power of God. And so as time has gone on, we've gotten a little more comfortable with those accounts, and we're using them all together to create this composite picture of how translation worked during those miraculous years when Joseph Smith was receiving the text of the Book of Mormon. Now, to those of you that might still feel like it's strange to use a seer stone or to use Nephite interpreters to receive the Book of Mormon, that's part of the miracle of the story. This incredibly complex text is produced in an incredibly short period of time, and it stood the test of time for over almost 2 centuries now as people have examined and looked at it. That's the miracle of the Book of Mormon. And the idea that we sometimes use objects to mediate with God or receive his will is well couched in the scriptures. President Dallin H. Oakes, a few years ago, made this statement. He said, "It should be recognized that such tools as the Urim and Thummim, Leohonis, Seerstones, and other articles have been used appropriately in biblical, Book of Mormon, and modern times. If you're a little uncomfortable using objects, think about the fact that on Sunday we regularly use water and bread to mediate with God. It's not that there's anything special or supernatural about water or bread, but when we bless them, they become a physical means by which we mediate with God's power. Likewise, if you've ever received or given a blessing using consecrated oil, the oil in and of itself becomes a divine object that's used to mediate with God. Or you might ask yourself, why does a person sometimes pray in a temple and feel that it gives them a better chance of communicating with God and discerning and knowing his will? It's a location, it's a building, it's a sacred object that allows us to draw closer and be nearer to our Father in heaven and understand his will. Likewise, with the seer stones and interpreters that were used with the Book of Mormon, we don't know everything about the process, but we do know what the process produced. And I testify to you that the Book of Mormon is of divine origin, that it teaches us about Jesus Christ and his mission. And just like Joseph Smith said, it did come forth by the gift and power of God. And for that, I'm grateful and bear my testimony. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.